This is English shorthand dictation number 284 and the dictation speed is 100 words per minute. Ready? Start. The Union government is facing significant criticism because of the falling rupee. It has fallen over 10% against the dollar since the beginning of the year. The Chief Minister of Delhi added another angle to the economic debate this week by suggesting that images of Hindu gods be printed on currency notes to improve well-being in the country. This is problematic and has been said with narrow political objectives. India is a secular republic, not a Hindu state. This is also worrying because political discourse seems to have shifted to a point where everything is seen through the prism of religion. This is a slippery slope and must be avoided. Political parties in general are expected to have a more informed debate on economic management. Changing the currency notes or pictures on them will not help. Generally, political debates on the currency are focused on its nominal value against the dollar, which should also be avoided. Directly relating the nominal strength of the currency to the economy has resulted in a systematic bias for a stronger rupee. All political parties have adopted the same approach depending on their position in parliament. There are a variety of reasons why the rupee has been under pressure, and most of them are not in India's control at the moment. It is important to recognize that India imports most of the crude oil it needs, and higher prices affect its external position. Since oil prices are on the higher side and are expected to remain so in the near future, India's current account deficit will remain elevated, putting pressure on the rupee. Apart from the oil and trade factors, there are other issues affecting currency movements at this stage. The dollar is strengthening, which has resulted in a fall in most currencies, including hard currencies like the euro, yen, and pound. In fact, the rupee had fallen less than a number of currencies, partly because of interventions by the Reserve Bank of India. Since the US Central Bank is tightening monetary conditions at a faster pace than most central banks, capital is flowing to the US. Since both importers and foreign investors are demanding more dollars, its value compared to the domestic currency is increasing. As the US Federal Reserve is likely to keep increasing rates, the pressure on the rupee is likely to continue. It is worth recognizing that depreciation in the currency is actually necessary. Not allowing the rupee to fall when all other currencies are falling would affect India's external competitiveness. A stronger currency would benefit consumers and hurt producers. Also, it is difficult for a country dependent on capital flows to defend its currency in such an environment. It could end up creating bigger imbalances and financial stability risks. The foreign currency reserves accumulated by the central bank should be used judiciously to contain excess volatility, as is the stated position of the Reserve Bank of India. Therefore, it is important that political debates about the economy are informed and do not put unnecessary pressure on institutions. Debates should focus on attaining higher growth with a balanced budget and lower inflation. This would help ensure stability and prosperity in the long run. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has released its yearly summary of developments related to the climate commitments made by the various parties to the convention. These commitments were part of the compromise hammered out in the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and are meant to be revised and strengthened on a regular basis. The latest report mentions marginal progress being made over the past year. This has come from almost 40 countries issuing new or updated contributions that enhance their pledges. These new contributions, if fully put into practice, might lead to emission levels over the coming decade being about 5% lower than in the previous scenario. In addition, the overall picture suggests that global emissions might now peak before 2020. The effort, however, remains inadequate to contain the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. This report comes shortly prior to the 27th Conference of Parties to be held this year in Egypt. It is natural to ask, therefore, how it impacts the negotiations to take place at that summit. Last year's conference, hosted by the United Kingdom in Glasgow, was preceded by frenetic diplomacy intended to get several countries to sign up to net zero targets. In the end, that diplomacy was largely effective, with Prime Minister of India himself committing the Indian economy to carbon neutrality by 2070. Yet the conference itself did not end with a sufficiently large number of countries updating their commitments, as was envisaged in Paris 6 years earlier. Several countries are now being perceived as being left behind when it comes to climate action. Several other issues, including compensation for loss and damage, were pushed back to be discussed in the next conference. It is especially worth noting that even the most optimistic view of additional commitments relies on there being sufficient support in terms of finance and technology. When Mr. Modi made his net zero commitment, he conditioned it on these two factors being made available. The 2030 targets for renewable energy also vitally require that greater amounts of finance and easier access to cutting-edge technology be prioritized. In other words, the developed world's responsibilities do not end with updating their own contributions. It is also necessary that they live up to past pledges on green finance and increase those commitments to fulfill the legitimate needs of those developing countries which are having to invest in new infrastructure to support tightening contributions. On this aspect, there has not been great progress in past years. At the very least, a credible recommitment to this target will be required if the rest of the world is to make a real effort to not just meet but update existing climate action efforts as expressed through their contributions. Developing countries will struggle without the necessary financial support.